to be renewed in the spirit of your minds and to put on the new self created after the likeness of God in true righteousness and holiness. Once again, something profound. He says you can be renewed in your mind, but not put on the new self. Like you can actually be like, your mind can be convinced of who Jesus is, but you still got the old clothes on. He says, take the old stuff off and put on the new, and the new is made in the likeness of God in true righteousness. Not hypocritical self-righteousness, true righteousness and holiness. And this is just one of the lists that we get to see all the nice fits that we have in the kingdom of God. We also see it in Galatians chapter 5, where he gives another list of things. Anger, sorcery, sexual promiscuity, and he goes down the list, and then he says, well, these things have nothing to do with the fruit of the Spirit. The fruit of the Spirit are love, joy, peace, patience, gentleness, kindness, self-control. This is what the new self is supposed to look like. That's what happens when we change what we see in the mirror and reflect God's image, the likeness of God. We start to look more like Jesus to other people. But then there's something very interesting that happens at the end of this passage in verse 25. The word reveals that what James refers to as the law of liberty. In verse 25, we see, but the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, this is the one who is able to be changed. And I think we just have to ask a really important question. How can the perfect law be the law of liberty? Because if we're honest, have you ever thought that you knew what you looked like in a mirror at home, and then you go to like a hotel, one of them joints that have like the bright lights around the mirror, and all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh. Or you just used to like the shoulder length ones, and then you get a body joint, and it's just like, okay, this is real. Like it was funny when like HD cameras first came on the scene, like all the actors and stuff were like freaking out because it was like, yo, like, and this is the word that they would use. These cameras are unforgiving because they show every flaw and every crack. And so there's this tension that I see when I read the perfect law and the law of liberty, because James himself in chapter 2 will also go on to say, for whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become guilty of it all. Talk about a mirror that shows imperfections. He said, for he who said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not murder. If you do not commit adultery, but you murder, you have become a transgressor of the law. God's standard is way up there. So that can end up feeling like bondage. Oftentimes, we even hold ourselves to a standard of beauty that reflects some standard that's unrecognizable and unrealistic and impossible. And if we look at ourselves in the mirror and go, that's what I'm comparing myself to, that doesn't feel like liberty at all. It feels like bondage. So how do we get there? Well, this is why it's so important to understand what James understands this side of the resurrection. As Pastor James mentioned in our first message on James, he wasn't a believer in his half-brother while he was still on earth. We see that throughout the text. It wasn't until after the resurrection that he goes back and looks back into the life of his and go, you are the Son of God. And it changes everything. And so then he goes back and understands when Jesus says some things, how this can manifest itself. So for instance, Jesus in Matthew 5 says this, do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets, but I have come not to abolish them, but to fulfill them. So even as he's raising the bar, even as he's challenging tradition, he's saying that I'm not doing anything out of step with what has already been revealed. But in fact, this standard that you can't reach, I'm not abolishing the standard. I'm saying I fulfilled the standard. And because I have fulfilled the standard, then that means you have access to actually making the standard that you wouldn't have had before. Okay, you're looking at me crazy. Now I got to go back. He said law and the prophets, right? Can I teach for a second? So this is where he's getting at. In Jeremiah 31, this is the prophecy that we see thousands of years before. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people, for I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sins no more. They had a covenant and an agreement with God that was something that they realized time and time again they could not keep. In fact, there was every year, which is still acknowledged by the Jewish people, Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement, and the day where, because they recognized the sins that they had of that year were not completely covered, they would sacrifice a lamb, put their hands on the lamb, bestowing their sin, transferring their sin onto that lamb, and that sacrifice, the bloodshed, would be the atonement for their sin. And Jesus says, I did not come to abolish the law, I came to fulfill the law. In other words, that was always pointing to me, which is why John the Baptist says, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Jesus, it had to be a perfect lamb. Jesus was a spotless lamb. He did not sin before the Father. And so that sacrifice was worthwhile and perfect. And so now, based on that new covenant, this is why we take communion at the Last Supper. He says, behold the new covenant that is poured out in my blood. Do this as often as you drink and eat in remembrance of me. That is entering in us and inviting us into a new space where we can be justified and made right before God, not because of what we do, but because of what we believe. However, at the same time, what we believe, if it's really authentic, it should transform itself in what we do. Which is why he ended the Sermon on the Mount with, don't be a hearer and not a doer, because that way, when the storms come, and some of us have had storms in our life, and you know what happens when it was built on your own self and was built on your own ingenuity, on your own whatever, and then the house fell down. But when you build it on the rock, you realize that regardless of whatever came, you can be sustained. All of this is built on this new covenant of Jesus. So the law of liberty can be good news, because even though God's standard is so high, his grace is even higher. Even though his standard is so high, our access to that grace is even higher because of what he's already done. It kind of reminds me a little bit, this word being a mirror, of Snow White. Y'all remember Snow White? The whole plot of the movie, the tension is the evil queen she has this magic mirror. And she said, what'd she say, y'all? Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all? And typically, the mirror would say her, because she had this magic going on, so whatever she needed done, she would just get that thing done and make herself the most beautiful person in the land. But one day what happens? Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? Actually, it's somebody else, not you. Wait, what? What happens? And the mirror says, and I quote, rags cannot hide her gentle grace. Alas, she is more fair than thee. Now, this is where it gets a little interesting. The strategy that the queen has to, once again, take the number one spot isn't to figure out what beauty tips she needs to tweak and adjust with this magic she has. Her strategy is to kill the number one person. Wow, that's a very interesting tactic, just murder, right? But in any event, what it reveals is that the other problem with hypocrisy, the other problem with trying to look in the mirror and not trying to change you, but change other people, is it ultimately results in comparison and jealousy. You also ultimately have to compare yourself to others. But the thing that's so powerful is even though the queen looked to take her competition out, the Prince of Peace looks to switch places with those who could never measure up to him. I'm telling y'all, the gospel is everywhere, y'all. Check it. In Isaiah 52, this is what we see. Just as there were many who were appalled at him, his appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any human being, and his form marred beyond human likeness. Isaiah is seeing in advance, in the future, the suffering servant that would be the one that would be our redemption. What it took for Jesus to be the sacrificial lamb was not something we should skirt over easily. And you should see the fact that even though he was the only one that could look in the mirror and say, I am the fairest of them all, he allowed himself to be beaten, to be bruised, to be whipped, and to be tortured for our sake. And he became disfigured as a result. So the one who is the highest standard didn't say, who is the fairest of them all, mirror, mirror. He said, Father, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing. And that is our access into the law of liberty, because it's no longer this unreachable standard that we are called to reach and claw and try and push other people down to get there to compare ourselves to them. But it's something much deeper, something much grander, something much more profound. Because it's based on a relationship that we have with Christ of what he's already accomplished. So now we don't do righteousness in order to justify ourselves. We do righteousness because we've already been justified. And that's good news. That's liberty. That frees me up. That means I can come to God and recognize I'm a wretch undone. I have aspects of my life that are still raggedy. I have aspects of my life that I still can't get right, even though I look in the mirror. And I need your help to do it. I need your grace to do it. And the law of liberty welcomes us in and says, I will give you both the means and the ability to not just be a hearer, but a doer. Jesus was disfigured so that we could be transfigured. There's an exchange that happens where he took the penalty that we deserved in our place so that we could experience transformation. The gospel, the law of liberty, empowers us to not just hear the word, but to do the word. And so he invites us, put off stewing in anger and killing other people's reputations with your gossip when you're upset at them. Put on forgiving those who sin against you and praying for your enemies. Put off lying on your taxes. I know what time it is. I know what time it is. Put on telling the truth even when it costs you money. Put off sleeping with people you're not married to or watching others who do. Put on seeing others as made in the image of God with dignity and respect. Put off exploiting people who have less power than you, and put on advocating for the poor and the marginalized. Put off being hearers only of the word. Put on doing what the law of liberty says and be set free. Bible consumption without action is deception. Bible consumption with action is transformation.